Welcome back to another episode of the USG training workbook. Thanks for hopping on back, you guys. If you have not done so already, you guys know the drill, but if you don't know the drill, grab your notebook, grab your tablet, grab your pen, grab your paper. Let's get started. I love talking about net metering, you guys. I just do. I'm very passionate about it. I think I'm passionate about it because I've been in the solar industry for quite some time now. So I've seen the net metering program kind of at its height, and I've also seen it throughout the years. So I think it's a fascinating subject to talk about. I love net metering. Let's get into it. I'm going to read this off just so we can get started. Net metering is a billing mechanism that credits solar energy systems. If you have not done so already, please go hop into our previous episode because we talked about how solar works. And at the last step, if you've noticed, that last step of how solar works 101 is that measurement and meter that tracks the production of your solar. When we get into net metering and things like that, we're going to talk about a PV system, which is literally a photovoltaic system. I used to love to quiz my team on what photovoltaic meant because it is such a fun word. Photovoltaic is a very, very elaborate word for solar panels. That's pretty much it. But it sounds really fancy and we love to throw it around. So a photovoltaic system is just solar. Let's dive into it. This is another breakdown of how solar works, but specifically to net metering because it highlights, bada boom, bada bang, the meter. So this is literally what we just learned in the previous chapter, but we are going to highlight right here the meter. This is what we're talking about now because we know how solar works, right? That's this whole portion right here. And if you haven't gone and learned it in the previous chapter, go take some time to do so that way we don't have to explain it in this one. But right now we're going to focus on the meter. Let's get into it. Without a net meter or a meter, there would be no way, we wouldn't be measuring the production of a system. And when we talk about production, we're also going to talk about consumption. And when we mean consumption, we mean what a homeowner is consuming. And this is going to actually follow into one of our vocab words or terminology, however you'd like to say, which is offset. Offset. You're going to see this in a proposal. You're going to hear this talked about all the time. Offset. And not offset the wrapper. Let me say that. It is offset in regards to solar. But offset is literally production, what a solar produces, versus consumption, what a homeowner consumes. And our goal in solar and for our clients and our homeowners is to get the best offset. Typically, if we have an offset of 90%, that means the solar is going to produce 90% of what that homeowner consumes. We typically want to get an offset between 95 and 100% offset is pretty much the peak offset. Obviously, any offset, depending on what the homeowner's needs are, would work. But if I were a homeowner, I would want 100% offset because that means 100% of what my solar is producing will cover 100% of my consumption. The way that we know what we're producing right here is this meter that we just talked about. And as we talked about in the previous chapter, and it's actually highlighting it right here, is that the grid is acting like a battery. But what we learned in the previous chapter is that it gets used in real time. So if you overproduce, so scenario, if your offset is 105%, you're going to have an overproduction of 5% that always goes back to the grid. It's going to be used in real time, so you have to have some way of tracking it. This is where the meter comes in, and this is where the buyback program comes in. When you produce more than you use, the excess electricity will flow back to the grid. Your meter will spin backwards. When you do not produce enough solar electricity for your home, your meter spins forward as it has. Now, we get asked this all the time. What happens if I don't produce enough electricity? And this actually might, let's take a little scroll. This actually might be one of the questions on here. Yeah. What happens, we have what happens to extra electricity, but let's talk about what happens if you don't produce enough. Okay. A client or homeowner is going to ask this quite often is what happens if it is cloudy for, I don't even know, whatever some scenario in which they don't produce enough electricity for their system or their needs. I always say this is that the previous months that you've produced are going to have the credit to take care of those months that are under consumption. So typically in the winter months, you're not going to produce as much, right? It's just the winter months you don't produce as much. The summer months and the peak heat and sun and just beating down on your roof, ideal time for solar, right? Well, you're going to have an overproduction in the summer. That overproduction is getting credited. So when you have that credit, it's going to literally roll into that next month. That is going to take care of some underproduction. Scenario too, we always talk about Christmas time or times where you're using a surplus of energy. Those previous months where you consumed when you produced a crazy amount of electricity, that is going to take care of those months where you have to anticipate a higher electricity usage, okay? Let's scroll down. Well, let's talk about it. We've already talked about this multiple times, but let's make sure we understand what happens to extra electricity. Let's kind of put this in text. We're not going to need to read this, right? We don't need to read this whole paragraph. You can do that on your own, but what happens to extra electricity? It gets tracked / credited to your utility. Okay, that's it. With solar, you're constantly tracking. It's literally tracking second by second what you are producing. If you have an excess, it gets tracked, credited to your utility, and the surplus goes back to the grid. This keeps the stress on the grid lower. Okay? People are like, why would I want lower stress on the grid? Well, let me tell you, do you want a power outage? No, thank you. I was actually in Texas during the snowpocalypse, which was like a year ago. Texas got this insane amount of snow. Basically, our grid froze up by all means, right? The Texas grid is one of the most vulnerable grids. I'm not actually going to be very confident and say that the Texas grid is the most vulnerable grid in the United States of America. It has not been updated. There is a lot of stress on it. There is a lot of new homes being built, and this grid has not been updated for decades, okay? So it is not designed for the amount of stress and homeowners and people at this time. Well, this showed the vulnerability of the grid. This showed why we need to update our grid and why we need solar. First of all, it's going to take the stress off the grid. I personally did not have power for like a week and a half. It was literally so cold. We didn't have power, we didn't have water, we couldn't heat our food. I'm talking cold. We weren't ready for this, and our grid was not ready for this. It exposed the vulnerability of the grid, but it exposed why we need solar. We had individuals in our neighborhood who had a battery, right, which stores the production of these panels. They had lights on, they had heat, they were cooking meals for their neighbors. They had power. Those of us that were connected to the grid did not have power. This was one of the biggest reasons why I was an advocate for solar in Texas. I'm no longer in Texas now, I'm in Florida. But this is why I was a huge advocate of solar, because I firsthand experienced the individuals who had solar during the snowpocalypse, and they were actually taking care of a lot of individuals in the neighborhood. We could go over there and charge our phones. They were really nice and kind, and they knew that at some point this was going to happen because they knew our grid was not sustainable. Now, this goes into a question of what happens if I have solar and the grid goes out. You're going to hear this question all the time, and I want you to take a moment and kind of think about this. If the grid acts as your battery pack and it stops, the battery stops, so in quote, the grid, you lose power because your battery is the grid. That is where you're running through your electricity in real time. The only way to have power during a power outage with a grid that is completely out is to have a way to store your power for a longer term of time. And that is with batteries. That is how if you want to be 100% off the grid, you need to have a battery. That is where you're storing the grid, or you're storing your power. You're still connected to the grid, net metering. You still got to connect to the grid, but you're going to be able to be sustained off the grid with that battery power. So that's a fun fact. We'll throw that in there. Going and diving into this, please describe 4 major benefits to net metering. We discussed quite a few. Let's name my favorite benefits to net metering. And we're going to actually dive more into net metering and the program in itself later on in these next chapters. So I'm just going to kind of give you some highlights of net metering that may or may not already know. Net metering, I'm going to say keep stress off the grid. Lowers stress on the grid. How about that? Lowers stress on the grid. Another benefit to net metering is going to be net metering federal incentives. I'm going to say see below chapters. We're going to break down these incentives and things like that later on, but that is a huge benefit, is incentives that come with this. Now with our company, our incentives vary based on the year and the season. So seek your on-site manager to see what incentives are being offered at this time. But net metering federal incentives. This one is huge. People get a 26% federal tax credit. Now it's not we're going to dive into what a tax credit is and things like that. A lot of people don't understand how tax credits work and what they do to your taxes and things like that, but we'll dive into it. Honestly, when I first got into this industry, I was not sure how this tax credit worked. Lower stress on the grid, net metering federal incentives. I'm going to add credit for overproduction. And this, I'm going to also put this varying based on utility provider. Because just like we've talked about, not all utility providers will offer a buyback. Lastly, number 4, another benefit for net metering. I'm going to say, let's see how I'd like to say this. Fixed lower rate all year around. Solar is fixed all year around. That is a huge benefit to the net metering program. Fixed lower rate all year round. And if you have fixed lower rate all year round and you get credits for overproduction and you get net metering federal incentives and you're lowering the stress on your grid, helping your neighbors out for power outages, oh my gosh, this is like a win-win-win-win. So there's a lot of benefits to doing and participating in the net metering program, which is a federal program put in place back in 2016. So there's a lot of benefits for net metering, specifically for the grid, your neighbors, yourself included, credits, and ultimately saving money annually, yearly, and for the next decade. Please use the link below to learn more about net metering. We have this is actually, I'm going to highlight this one. Please use this one as a resource. I used to print this out and keep this in a folder when I would go talk to clients. This particular link is a huge resource to understand how net metering works. It's constantly being updated. This particular website is always being updated. There's so many resources for federal incentives, residential solar, and commercial solar. You'll see probably this link varying throughout our time here in these lessons, but also there's a YouTube video right here. Please go check that out. Just like I said, we are going to be providing YouTube videos and links to further extend y'all's knowledge on solar and the net metering program. So thanks for hopping on to one of my favorite chapters to talk about, net metering. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to working with you guys in the next chapter.